Kristen Atchison here, and we are still talking about memory, but now we're going to talk about forgetting. So there's a couple kind of ways we can forget that we're going to talk about today. The first of which is encoding failure. That just means that it didn't get into memory right. Somehow it didn't get encoded properly, and that's why we can't remember it. And the other kind that we're going to talk about is retrieval failure. That there's something that's keeping us from being able to retrieve that information. And there's three different kinds that we're going to talk about: interference, storage decay, and tip of the tongue phenomenon. So why do we forget? Forgetting can occur at any stage of the memory process. So it cannot properly get encoded. So something with sensory memory doesn't encode it properly. We're not paying attention. Something doesn't happen there. It can have a problem and working short-term memory, that they're not being noticed, they're not being recorded, they're not being put in to long-term memory. We can also have problems in long-term memory. Some items are lost, some items are altered, and then we can have problems actually getting the memories out of long-term memory. Sometimes things just don't come out. So when we process information, we filter it or alter it, or we can lose parts of it. And so this can really result in many different reasons why we can't remember something, because we can have a failure at any step of the process. So the first one we're going to talk about is encoding failure. We can't remember what was encoded. So that information, whatever it was, hopefully it's not me talking, but hopefully it's not this lecture, but maybe it is. Maybe this lecture is that external event and it's coming into sensory memory and you are paying attention to it. But in somewhere between working and short-term memory, there's something that's happening in encoding and it never gets into long-term memory. So this is not that you're not paying attention. This is maybe we're not making enough connections. Maybe we're not taking notes. Maybe we're not making self-references. Any number of things that are putting up that roadblock between your working memory and short-term memory and your long-term memory storage. And so something's keeping it from getting encoding properly into long-term memory. Now, if it never gets into long-term memory, how are you going to be able to remember it? And so we won't see that you'll be able to remember that thing. And there's a number of different things that can happen along the way that can cause encoding failure. This is not paying attention to it. This is, there's something in the encoding process that doesn't get done right. Again, we're not making those connections. We're not doing that kind of feedback loop between long-term memory and working memory. Something that's keeping this creating this encoding failure. So this information is never encoded into long-term memory. If it's not encoded into long-term memory, there's no way you're going to be able to remember it. Some memories can't be encoded without effort. It would be really great if education was stuff that you could encode all of the things that you needed to without effort. But that's not the case that we're in. That's not the situation that we're in. We have to put forth that effort to encode this new information, to remember this new information. And so that encoding really has to happen, that deeper encoding, that deeper processing, so that those memories can get into long-term storage. And so again, things like note-taking, translating it into your own words instead of verbatim, things like making those self-references, those are kinds of things that effort helps get them into long-term memory so that we don't result in an encoding memory for what you learned in biology class, or what you learned in your history class, or hopefully what you learned in this class. Okay, so we're going to move on to kinds of retrieval failure now. The first one we're going to talk about is interference. And this is the idea that information can interfere with other information and keep us from being able to remember it. Okay, so there's two main kinds that we're going to talk about. The first is proactive, and this is the previous information affects our ability to learn new information. So my parents, and when I was growing up, lived in the same place from the time before I was born until I was 36 probably. And they had the exact same phone number that entire time. I know that number forwards and backwards. It was my phone number as a child. It was the phone number I called when my daughter was little. I know that phone number backwards and forwards. they moved to a new house and they got a new phone number, and it's not just cell phones, but I have no idea what that number is because I have proactive interference. The effect of that prior information, that previous information, is affecting my ability to learn this new stuff. Retroactive interference would be the reverse. It would be the new information is impairing my ability to recall the old information. So if I get a new cell phone and I learn my new cell phone really, really well, and I can't remember my old cell phone number, that would be an example of retroactive interference. So again, retroactive interference is the new information affects our ability to remember the old information. It interferes with that. And in proactive interference, the old information affects our remembering for the new information. So again, retroactive, and I know students struggle with this, so that's why I'm kind of going to beat this dead horse a little bit. Retroactive interference, that retro, that after, that previous thing, is where we're having a hard time remembering that interfering materials learned after the target material, okay? So too much has happened since I studied it, okay? So if you took, if at the final, if you can't remember information from chapter 1, that could be retroactive interference. All the chapters that came after it are interfering with your ability to remember what you learned in chapter 1. That would be retroactive interference. Another idea is proactive interference. And again, this is the idea that you can't take any new information in. This would be that you're really going to be, your information, your knowledge of chapter 1 is interfering with your ability to recall information from our therapy chapter, which is our last chapter in this course. So that would be proactive interference, where the information learned before the target is what is interfering. So again, more examples, because people struggle with this. Say you're in a general math class. And in the general math class, you learn algebra first, and then you learn calculus, okay? So you learn both of them. You have memories for both of them. When you go to take your general math test at the end, if you have retroactive interference, then you're going to struggle with the algebra questions because the new calculus questions are interfering with your ability to remember those old algebra questions. So calculus would be interfering with algebra because you learned calculus second after algebra. In proactive interference, we'd have the reverse, where the calculus is the stuff that'd be easier to remember because that's the new information, but we would struggle to remember we would struggle to remember calculus because that algebra is interfering, that information we have from before is interfering with our ability to learn that new information. So again, we can have both retroactive and proactive, and they affect differently that information. Okay, so another kind of retrieval failure that we can have is storage decay. And this is the idea that memories just gradually decline and fade away and decay if they're not used, right? So just like something can rot, it's kind of the same idea that your memory can decay away. So first, when we first learn something, there's a really rapid fall off of that information. And then after a certain period, that kind of levels off. Now, storage decay does not explain all instances of forgetting. We've already talked about interference as an example, encoding as an example, encoding failures as ways that we can have forgetting. But storage decay theory accounts for a lot of it. So again, this idea that at first we have a big loss in memory. So this is a vocabulary. There was vocabulary in a Spanish course. At first, the first 3 years, there was a really rapid decline in the vocabulary words remembered from the Spanish course. And then it levels off, and we kind of stay in that 40 to 30% range. So there's this initial rapid loss, and then kind of levels off through time. And this is, again, an example of that storage decay theory. Your book talks about this research from Barrick that really shows this forgetting curve, that we have this initial storage decay. And again, this is because of lack of use. Now, this is not someone who took a Spanish course and then is continuing to use Spanish. This is someone who took a Spanish course and then didn't do anything with their Spanish afterwards. And so because that information is not being reused, it's not being relearned, it's not going through rehearsal, we do see this storage decay. The last one that we're going to talk about is tip of the tongue phenomenon. And this is that effortful retrieval of known information. And so we're trying to get that information. We can tell you all the things around the thing, but you can't remember that one word or that one thing. You can retrieve some of the information, but not all of the information. So I have an example of this from when I was pregnant with my daughter. I was teaching an upper division research methods course called Experimental Projects at the University of Texas at Dallas. And if you are familiar with anything experimental projects related, validity and reliability are big. We've talked about them a little bit in this class. Reliability is the idea that you get the same answer every single time. Your measurement, you're getting the same thing. So if your scale is reliable, it's getting the same measurement. You take your weight 3 times in a row, you get the same weight 3 times in a row. That would be reliable. Valid is it true, right? So am I measuring what I think I'm measuring? And so we were talking with a group of students. It was me and my teaching assistant, and I'm probably 7 months pregnant at this time. And reliability and validity are things that I've been learning about and teaching about at this point, probably 15 years. Maybe not 15, maybe only 10, but still for a while. And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to explain the thing to them. I'm like, that thing, it was validity. I couldn't remember validity. I was like, it's not reliability. It's the other one. It's that thing. And I could define it and I could tell you all the words around it. I could tell you the other one, but I could not remember the word validity to save my soul. And my TA and my students are just staring at me like, what's wrong with you, Dr. Atchison? Now, we do know that pregnancy can affect memory, but that was my most embarrassing tip of the tongue phenomenon, because here we are in this meeting, and I'm Dr. Atchison, supposed to be helping them design these experiments, and I can't remember the word validity, which is one of the most basic research methods terms there is. And this is like the third level of research methods. So again, that's the tip of the tongue phenomenon, this effortful retrieval of known information. And we can retrieve some of it, but not all of it. And for the life of you, you can't figure out why. It's not that you don't have that information, because I still have it. I just couldn't get it out. I was having a retrieval failure. Okay, on that amusing anecdote, that ends our discussion of forgetting. Thanks.